Most women don't actually know what emotional maturity feels like. They know what it looks like. They know what it's supposed to sound like. They know how it's described by people who have never had to survive inside emotional confusion. So they tolerate things that slowly dismantle them. They call it patience. They call it growth. They call it being secure. But their body never relaxes. That's the part no one talks about. Because emotional immaturity doesn't always come with chaos. Sometimes it comes with calm tones and empty presence. Sometimes it comes with consistency, without depth. And women stay because it doesn't look abusive, but it feels lonely, and they blame themselves for that. Here's the truth that unsettles people. If you have to keep regulating yourself to stay connected, that is not emotional maturity. That is emotional containment, and it costs more than you think. Emotional maturity does not feel confusing. It does not require you to reinterpret your needs. It does not reward silence. It does not make you question whether you're asking for too much. When you ask for basic attunement, if you're honest, you didn't stay because it felt good. You stayed because you learned how to endure disconnection without making noise. And that skill was praised. You were called grounded. You were called understanding. You were called low maintenance. But your nervous system was working overtime. You learned how to stay composed while unmet, how to smile while bracing, how to soothe yourself in the presence of someone who didn't soothe you. That is not emotional maturity. That is early adaptation, and it's often mistaken for strength. Emotional maturity doesn't feel like effort. It feels like settling, not settling for less, settling into safety. Your body knows the difference. In emotionally mature connection, your system doesn't scan. It doesn't anticipate withdrawal. It doesn't prepare explanations before expressing a feeling. It doesn't rehearse conversations in your head. It doesn't brace for emotional distance. After intimacy, you don't shrink your reactions to keep the peace. You don't soften truths so they'll land easier. You don't carry the emotional temperature of the relationship alone. That's the clearest signal. Emotional maturity is mutual regulation, not perfect regulation. Mutual. It's the feeling of being responded to, not just listened to. It's knowing that your emotions won't overwhelm or inconvenience the other person. It's being able to say, something didn't sit right with me, without preparing for fallout. And most women don't realize how unfamiliar that feels until they experience it once, because they were trained to be resilient, not supported. They were praised for staying calm, not met. So when emotional maturity shows up, it feels almost quiet, not exciting, not intense, quiet in the body. The absence of bracing, the absence of inner dialogue, the absence of self-monitoring. And that can feel boring to a nervous system that learned love through alertness. This is where confusion happens. Women mistake chemistry for connection. They mistake depth for intensity. They mistake emotional unavailability for mystery, because emotional maturity doesn't spike your nervous system. It stabilizes it. And stability can feel unfamiliar when you've learned to associate love with effort. You didn't stay in immature dynamics because you lacked standards. You stayed because your body hadn't yet learned what calm connection feels like. So you normalized dysregulation. You normalized waiting. You normalized explaining. You normalized being the emotional container for two people. That becomes your baseline. And anything healthier feels strange. This is why emotionally mature connection often feels anticlimactic at first. There's no chase, no anxiety, no constant analysis. no emotional withholding to decode. And without those signals, your system doesn't know what to do. It expects effort. It expects distance. It expects emotional labor. But emotional maturity doesn't demand proving. It doesn't make you earn presence. It doesn't reward you for being smaller. It doesn't punish you for having needs. It doesn't confuse consistency with depth. It doesn't rely on potential. It relies on availability. And availability is felt immediately, not over time, not after patience. Immediately, your body softens, your breath deepens, your mind quiets. You don't feel rushed. You don't feel unsure. You don't feel like you're waiting for the other shoe to drop. That's not because you're naive. It's because your nervous system is finally co-regulating. This is where most women pause. Because once you feel this, you can't unfeel it. You start noticing how much effort other connections required, how much self-silencing you called maturity, how much emotional labor you normalized. And that realization is destabilizing, not because you're losing something, but because you're gaining clarity. And clarity doesn't shout. It settles. It removes urgency. It removes confusion. It removes the need to convince yourself. Emotional maturity doesn't make you chase. It doesn't make you perform healing. It doesn't require you to be endlessly patient. It meets you where you already are. And if that feels unfamiliar, nothing is wrong with you. It just means you're recalibrating. Your body is learning that love doesn't have to hurt quietly to be real. Once your body tastes what emotional maturity actually feels like, it starts rejecting what you used to tolerate. Not dramatically, quietly. You don't get angry. You get uninterested. That's how you know this isn't ego. It's regulation. Emotionally mature connection doesn't pull you into loops. There's no constant replaying conversations. No wondering what you meant. No trying to decode tone. No waiting for reassurance. That should already be implied. You notice how much space opens up in your mind, how your thoughts slow down, how you stop narrating the relationship to yourself. That narration was never about curiosity. It was about safety. You were trying to stay oriented in an emotionally inconsistent environment. That takes energy. And when that energy is no longer required, you feel it immediately. Not excitement, relief. Emotional maturity feels like your nervous system no longer having to translate. You say something, it lands. You express discomfort, it's received. You don't have to exaggerate to be taken seriously. You don't have to soften to avoid defensiveness. You don't have to regulate for them. That mutual regulation is the difference. Because before, you were doing all the work internally, holding your feelings, timing your honesty, managing their reactions, anticipating withdrawal. That was never intimacy. That was vigilance. And vigilance can masquerade as closeness for a very long time, especially when you're capable, especially when you're emotionally intelligent, especially when you've been praised for being so understanding. But understanding without reciprocity turns into emotional loneliness, and emotional maturity doesn't leave you lonely in connection. It leaves you accompanied in discomfort, accompanied in repair, accompanied in silence. That's a critical distinction because emotionally immature dynamics abandon you emotionally. The moment things get uncomfortable, they withdraw, they deflect, they minimize, they go neutral, and you're left holding not just your feelings, but the relationship itself. Emotionally mature connection doesn't disappear under pressure. It stays engaged, not perfectly, but present. Presence is what your body responds to, not words, not intentions, Presence. This is why emotional maturity feels grounding instead of intoxicating. It doesn't flood your system, it stabilizes it. And for women who learn love through emotional unpredictability, that stability can feel unfamiliar, even suspicious. You might notice yourself waiting for the shift, for the withdrawal, for the emotional drop, but it doesn't come. And slowly, your body stops bracing. That's the recalibration. You don't become less emotional. You become less dysregulated. Your feelings still exist. They just don't hijack you because they're being met. This is where discernment sharpens. You stop asking, is this normal? You start asking, how does this feel in my body? And your body answers clearly. Tension or ease, contraction or expansion, alertness or calm. Emotional maturity feels like ease, without dissociation, calm without suppression, safety without self-abandonment. And once you recognize that feeling, you can't unknow it. You start noticing how often you had to explain yourself before, how often you minimized your reactions, how often you waited for emotional permission, not because you wanted to, because you adapted. And adaptation is not the same as alignment. Emotional maturity doesn't ask you to adapt who you are. It meets you there. That's why it feels steady, not because nothing ever goes wrong, but because repair doesn't threaten the bond. You don't fear honesty. You don't fear needs. You don't fear being seen clearly. And that freedom is what your nervous system has been seeking all along. Once your body starts recognizing ease, you begin noticing effort differently. You notice how much you used to give without being met, how much energy was spent on anticipating reactions, how often you monitored yourself to keep them comfortable. That was never maturity. It was survival. And survival can masquerade as strength. For decades, women are trained to equate tolerance with love, to equate patience with loyalty, to equate emotional labor with care. That's why we stayed. Not because we didn't deserve better, because we didn't know what better felt like. And when emotional maturity shows up, it doesn't yell. It whispers. It calms. It settles. And that's unsettling because the nervous system learned to associate love with tension. It learned that intensity is normal. It learned that effort is constant. It learned that if something feels easy, it's suspicious. But emotional maturity doesn't need defense. It doesn't need drama. It doesn't need performance. It simply exists. And your nervous system recognizes it immediately. The absence of chaos feels like freedom, and freedom feels unfamiliar. If you've been bracing for instability, you notice your body softening before your mind understands why. The psychological cost of immaturity becomes clear. It's not heartbreak, it's erosion, small cuts over time that teach you to doubt yourself, small silences that teach you to censor your voice, small absences that teach you to normalize emotional starvation. That's why recognition is the first step, because without seeing it clearly, you self-correct endlessly. You keep trying to fix yourself instead of observing the system you're in. You keep wondering if you're too sensitive, too intense, too demanding, when the reality is that you were simply unmet. And emotional maturity teaches you this truth without judgment. It doesn't shame. It doesn't blame. It simply shows you how your nervous system feels when your needs are respected. It teaches you that being met doesn't require compromise of self. That being safe doesn't require silence. That being seen doesn't require explanation. That being heard doesn't require constant permission. And this is why, once recognized, you begin to recalibrate. You stop over-explaining. You stop justifying your reactions. You stop performing love. To be accepted, you start listening to your body. Instead of cultural rules, you start trusting tension. As feedback, you start trusting calm. As confirmation, you begin noticing who actually meets you and who just exists nearby. You don't chase. You don't convince. You observe. And observation brings clarity. Clarity brings self-trust. Self-trust brings empowerment. But before it can, you must sit with the cost of being overgiving, the cost of being unmet, the cost of mistaking adaptation for emotional intelligence. The cost of thinking patience is the same as emotional safety. When you see it, you stop tolerating. When you feel it, you stop compromising. When your body relaxes into alignment, you stop questioning your worth. And that's the threshold where emotional maturity truly lands. Once your nervous system feels alignment, everything else changes. You stop trying to force connection with people who can't meet you. You stop shrinking to fit someone else's capacity. You stop confusing effort with emotional presence. You start noticing who actually shows up without drama, without manipulation. And that noticing doesn't create urgency, it creates calm. You don't have to prove yourself. You don't have to negotiate love. You don't have to anticipate disappointment before expressing your truth. That's emotional maturity. It's regulation. It's clarity. It's co-regulation without effort. It's being able to hold discomfort without dissolving into it. It's being able to stay soft while boundaries are respected. It's understanding that reciprocity is the foundation of trust, not hope, not potential, not performance. It's the difference between being seen and being tolerated. It's the difference between being responsive and being present. And once you feel it, you recognize it immediately. You recognize the energy patterns you've been overgiving to. You recognize the dynamics that left you exhausted while staying calm. You recognize the relationships where your nervous system was doing all the work. That recognition doesn't make you bitter. It makes you steady. It makes you grounded. It makes you discerning. Without rigidity, you no longer fear leaving. You no longer fear being quiet. You no longer fear being fully yourself. Because maturity has shown you that the world doesn't require self-abandonment to belong. You can stay connected without losing yourself. You can give love without giving your energy away to regulation that isn't mutual. You can trust your body without doubting your perception. You can allow presence without demanding change. That's what emotional maturity actually feels like. Calm, clarity, self-trust. And if this named something you felt quietly, but never had language for, let it land. Notice how your body softens. As you read this, that's your nervous system, remembering what safety feels like. You don't need to act immediately. You don't need to chase answers. You only need to observe, regulate, and choose yourself in alignment with that truth. Because recognition is the first step toward empowerment. And when your body trusts you, everything else falls into place naturally.